measuring productivity is kind of worthless. I went through 14 white papers this week. Isn't that incredible? And I go, absolutely. But does it work? As an early stage startup, you really shouldn't have like a lot of overhead. You shouldn't be throwing big events. You shouldn't be paying for fancy lawyers.
Key metrics. So what are you looking at when, like specifically for operational metrics? Like what should the North Star be for a Web3 startup? What should you monitor regularly? How do you know whether, on your RAG status, it's red or amber or green?
But when it comes to metrics, especially in the early days, I think there's a few things. One, communication. I think it's not a metric you hear very often. But setting a cadence and establishing good habits for communication and check-in and being able to communicate effectively as a team what you're building and where you are in that process. Because of the nature of an early stage startup, you're going to have a lot of failures. And if you don't have the ability to document and communicate, right, documentation being part of that communication process, if you don't have the ability to do that and share that information with the rest of the team, measuring productivity is kind of worthless, right? Because you can show productivity, right? I checked off so many tickets in this week. I completed my sprint. I put in so many hours, right? There's all these other metrics that you can put towards building your solution. But if you don't have the proper communication behind that, it falls flat. And what you end up doing is spending a lot of time running around in circles or building in a direction that you didn't actually mean to. You just found out kind of too late. So yeah, when we're really starting off early, right, when it's going from a founding team of 2 or 3 people and you're growing to 5 people, 7 people, 9 people, it's continually checking in with your team and making sure that those check-ins are valuable and that you're actually sharing information in a way that's both effective and useful. Because if not, all these productivity metrics that you'll see people recommend, setting KPIs and tickets and sprints and all these things, it ends up being worthless.
Any other productivity side metrics? Should the communication be good?
Does it work? I mean, jokes aside, excuse me. But yeah, does it work? There was a lot of times that we were tracking, like, how much code did you actually write? How much research did you actually do? How much did you actually commit to the GitHub? But at the end of the day, if it doesn't work, that goes right out the window, right? Especially when you're heavily into research and development. We'd have team members who their bias would naturally drive them more towards either research or development. And so you'd get people that would spend a lot of time researching, and it's like, hey boss, like, I went through 14 white papers this week. Isn't that incredible? And I go, absolutely. But does it work? Like, do you have code for it? Like, is this something that's actually usable? Or on the flip side, hey boss, I committed 15 things to the GitHub this week. Does it work? Does it do what we need it to do? Or is it just code for the sake of code? And so again, kind of, I mean, it's not a metric, but always checking in, whether you're doing research or you're doing development, and keeping that in mind of, is this actually meeting the expectations of what we needed this step to be?
It's a lot about context in that matter, right? It's like numbers in and of itself mean nothing if there's no context to it. You can, as you said, like commit like 20 things to GitHub, but if it doesn't, there's no narrative or context behind it, then, that can be like 10 or 20 really small things or 20 really big things, but the metric in and of itself doesn't say anything, right? That one commit that you did, that one piece of work that you did, you've maybe done a month of work in that. So that's context as well.
And coming back down to, like, does it work? Or to your point, context, can someone else use this? Yeah. Like, is this at a point where I can now sequence this into what's ultimately going to become the solution, right? It doesn't matter if you're a plumber. It doesn't matter if you laid 100 feet of copper piping in all the walls. If it doesn't work, then the drywall guy can't come in and close up the walls, right? So even though you did the time, even though you did the work, if it's not actually completed, if it's not actually achieving turning the faucet on, right, then the next person in line can't start doing their work. And so I think, especially in the early stages, metrics are important. You do need to measure, but keeping, to your point, context kind of in front of mind, and making sure that the team is in sync and that your sequencing is as tight as possible. What you don't want is people waiting on other people and getting hung up on your dependencies. I'm a big fan of Gantt charts, dependencies, and kind of sequencing things out. I think this is, whether it's in a kitchen or in a construction project or in a tech company, it's important, right? Things come sequentially. Work in parallel when you can, but at some point, right, you need to start having these interactions between two different fields of expertise.
Absolutely. Okay, number 3, resource allocation. This is a big debatable one. Could you share your insights on how you'd effectively allocate resources in the early stages of a Web3 startup to maximize growth and sustainability?
So when most people think of resource allocation, they think of capital, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I wholeheartedly agree. Capital is incredibly important, right? I think, Charlie, you told me this. The number one job of a CEO is don't run out of money, right?
Keep it funded. Yeah.
I mean, one of three. But I think even more important than capital is time, right? And how you allocate your time and how you stay focused and making sure that you're not, chasing white rabbits all the time is incredibly important. A big part of that, and I don't see this enough, I think, especially from early stage founders, it's get out of your house, get out of your office, right? People try to build in a vacuum because it's comfortable. But what that does is it removes you from the context of what it is that you're trying to solve. And so I don't care if you're working in a co-working, I don't care if you're going to meetups, I don't care if you're just meeting up with other colleagues that, have an opinion on the work that you're doing in a restaurant or a cafe or a bar or a park or whatever. You need to create context for these kinds of discussions outside of what your work environment is so that you can really keep in focus what it is that you're doing all of this work for, and really managing that time right effectively. The second thing outside of capital is definitely like your team, right? Human resources, a horrible way of naming it, but how effectively are we using the true resource, right? That money is translated into expertise. How are we putting that to work? And the reality is that people need to stay motivated. People need to stay focused. People need to understand what you're building towards. I think there was an eye-opening moment. I think it was ETHCC last year. We did a whole debrief after the conference with our team, which was at that point largely research and development. Right, it was a bunch of engineers in a room and me. And how did you think it went? What were your conversations like? Who did you speak with? And after about 15, 20 minutes of having this debrief, the one thing that I learned was that I hadn't communicated where we had taken the marketing and the communication and the messaging and the product market fit to the engineering team. And I had really ineffectively allocated those resources to that conference, right? Everyone had a week where they weren't coding, they weren't doing what they were great at. And instead they were out here promoting the project and talking about what we were building. But the way they were talking about it was either very specific to what they were building or something that we had like a narrative or a message that we had abandoned a year ago, right? And so keeping the team up to date, communicating with them effectively, keeping them motivated, that's really, they're your best advocates, right? And so then the capital part kind of trickles into how do you allocate your time, how to allocate your team, right? I mean, outside of that, as an early stage startup, you really shouldn't have very much, like a lot of overhead. You shouldn't be throwing big events. You shouldn't be paying for fancy lawyers. Your accountant shouldn't be really much more than a bookkeeper, right? You want to keep all of that as lean as possible, and focus on your team and your time.
All right. Well, this files in nicely into, and you kind of answered this a little bit, but team building. Question 4. When you're looking for team members, what are the qualities you're looking for? And how do you then foster a culture that supports that? Innovation, yes, but that execution, like let's get stuff done.
Culture when it comes to early stage startups is interesting, especially when you're like very, very early, that 0 to 1. I've seen a lot of founders focus a lot on culture. Who do we want to be, right? I'm going to spend a week working on a document that details and outlines what kind of company we are, right? We are ping pong tables in bright colors, that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, right, you can try and influence that culture as much as you want. The culture will end up being the sum of the people that you are working with and the way that you interact. And so, particularly when you're hiring, right, make sure that this is a person who is, I mean, at least for me, right, not afraid to fail, not afraid to communicate that failure, not afraid to raise their hand when they have a problem, right, who's willing to ask for help, and willing to learn, right? When you're trying to do something differently, they're going to have to get outside of their comfort zone. And if you find people that kind of align to these, I don't know, driving values, the things that really make early creative stage startups work, then your culture will come naturally because of that. Obviously, once you start getting to 10, 15, 20 people, then you want to start solidifying and documenting and standardizing that culture, right? You need to be able to provide that culture as a directive for your HR manager for future hires, for your marketing team and the way that you communicate, right? The tone and the voice that your company collectively has. But at the early days, don't spend too much time trying to define what that culture is. Let it grow organically, take the best parts of it, and then reinforce those good behaviors, right? Those good habits with your team. So I think a big part of that is hiring slow and making sure that they fit, that they meet kind of what that is, not just from a technical expertise or a professional expertise standpoint, but also from, right, what's effectively an airport test, right? Will I like to sit down and actually have a conversation with this person?
Yep.
In the event that you mess that up, and this is something that, coming from a corporate background, my instinct is always to train and to try and help improve. But firing fast is something that I definitely could have improved on, and will do. Definitely treat it differently now. As a startup, again, resource allocation, you don't have the bandwidth to carry dead weight. So if you're confident that you've given this person the tools and the resources that they need to succeed, you've given them purpose, you've given them plan, you've given them goals that they can actually achieve, in an ideal situation, goals that you set together, right? Expectations that you set together that you decided that were mutually achievable. If you've given them a good shot, 30 days, 40 days, right? Something very tangible. I want to see difference. And if that's not the case, then, it doesn't work. And so, yeah, build your team up, hire slow, fire fast, trust your instincts. But also be cognizant of the fact that, it might be also you, right? Make sure you're not the problem in the team, and make sure that you're managing that effectively. Because I've seen both happen, right? Oh, fire fast. Oh, it's not working. Just fire it. No, that's not right. Make sure that you've taken a step back, really looked at yourself, had that open channel of communication with your employees, with your team, and then get there.